Good afternoon. Welcome. We are here for building a Tableau Center of Excellence. It is Thursday at the Tableau conference. So I know what that means when it's Thursday at the Tableau conference. Your brain is full. I know your brain is full. So my challenge today, just like, remember when you woke up this morning and you realized that you had bought or you had gotten a bunch of free stuff from the expo and you don't really have room in your luggage, so you were kind of doing this, trying to cram it all in before. That's your brain. And that's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to try to cram a little bit more in there before you go back. So hopefully it won't be too much and it won't be overwhelming. But I know there's a lot of information, and so I'm going to try to go through a lot of things about the Tableau Center of Excellence. We've got an hour. What I usually do is if you have questions that come up, like pertinent to the slide, can you explain, or what do you mean, or those kinds of things, I'm happy to, if you just raise your hand, and assuming I'll try to call on you best I can. I won't do too much of that, but if there's points of clarification, I'll try to make sure that we can do that in line, essentially. If there's other things, or specific situations you have pertinent to your company or things like that, I just ask that you save that. I'll be here afterwards if you want to talk about your specific COE issues, just so we can kind of try to get as much as we can in an hour. And I will try to leave some time at the very end for questions. So. My name is Michael Cox. I'm a principal architect with Tableau. What does a principal architect do? Well, we work with customers on a number of implementation issues, everything from building better dashboards to getting server configured correctly, enablement issues, things that have only a little bit to do with Tableau and have more to do with user acceptance and culture change and all those things. So I spend a lot of my time working on these issues, sometimes on very small tactical projects, other times on larger, more strategic projects. And a lot of these things that not just myself, but other folks in professional services do really end up being part of what is needed to build a COE. So I like talking about this topic because it's something that I think can be very, very effective, and I've seen some very effective implementations of this done in some of our customers. And it's rewarding to know that the kinds of things that if you implement these best practices, you will see changes. So I'm glad you're here. I like to talk about this. I'll try to get it all in, like I said, in the time that we have, and maybe leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. Okay, so a little bit about me. Sorry, this is right through the first slide. This is where I live. I live in Chicago. It doesn't look like that yet, but give us a couple of weeks and you never know. But I really kind of like that better. That's kind of like where I like to spend my spare time, my vacation time, all that. So pretty much the exact opposite of where I'm at and where I go on vacation. That's probably true of a lot of you as well. I was a little, I don't know if you watched the Iron Viz yesterday when they realized that Chicago and Barcelona were like the same distance from the equator. I'm like, how does that happen? Boy, I lost that coin flip somehow. Yeah, so I am from Chicago and all the dysfunctions that come along with that. I made these slides about a month ago, so I knew it was going to be World Series week, so I had all that ready, so we'll just kind of go right past that slide right now. My hopes were so high. I was like, oh, it's going to be the middle of World Series week. Okay, all right, so what are we going to talk about? I'll give kind of an overview of the COE, just kind of give you an idea of a little bit of some of the background, some of the things that are important. We'll go through the different components and the different competencies that are associated with the COE. I'm going to call them events, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. And then also, we're going to, at the end, we'll do a little bit of a project plan for a COE implementation. So when I say project plan, don't think like detailed day-by-day Gantt chart kind of thing. It's more, here's the general steps, right? So if you're trying to get started, if you're trying to kind of restart a COE, these might be some good things to look at. I've tried to create this in such a way that it would work for somebody who is just starting their journey and is kind of, sort of thought, maybe we should do a COE, right? And is kind of at that stage. And people who already have an established COE and are looking to do a better job, or looking to enhance it, or looking to make it better. So hopefully there's some content in there that will work kind of regardless of where you are in the journey. All right, so what is a COE? So I have the important wordy definition of a COE coming up, so you'll get that, so don't worry. But I thought, as I was thinking about kind of what it really is, I'm big on analogies, and I'll use a couple analogies throughout this presentation. So one of them I thought about for COE. So how many people have seen the Netflix show Nailed It? Okay, a few of you. How many of you are embarrassed to say that you've actually seen? Yeah, yeah, okay. The premise of the show is basically this. They have these beautiful like wedding cakes and things that have been created by professionals, and then they bring in like ordinary cooks, and they say, okay, this is what you have to build, and they like give them the instructions, and then the whole funny part of the show is that they can't do it, and it just comes out horrible. So, and it's actually, it's 25 minutes of your life you'll never get back, but like if you've been like, streaming like Breaking Bad or something, and you're like, I need something, light, this is the anecdote for it. So, so this would be a typical like example. They'll say, okay, this is what you're trying to build, and then they give them step-by-step instructions, and they give them all the ingredients. And then the whole premise of the show and the whole funny part is at the end they do the reveal, and that's, they're like, I nailed it, right? And so I thought when you're thinking about a COE, you are, to a certain extent, trying to create the nice-looking cake. You're trying to create best practices. You're trying to create something that looks good. You're trying to create, do things the right way. And if we simply kind of go out to our organizations and say, okay, here's the white paper on how to do visual best practices. Here's the white paper on how to configure server, all that, and we give them all the instructions. It's still going to end up like the cake on the side. There's really more. We have to be more engaged with than that. It's not enough to simply tell people what needs to happen. So the whole idea of COE is, yes, we're the shining example on the hill of how best practices could be done. But it's not just enough to sort of be kind of ivory tower about it, right? We need to get down there and work with them and actually create the cake so that we don't end up with, I've seen some visualizations that look a lot like that, relatively. So that's really, that's the best way kind of from a word picture perspective that I could say, how I describe a COE. The more official kind of, I don't know, corporate definition is something like this. It's a group of resources used to coordinate knowledge, processes, and best practice for the successful deployment and usage of Tableau technologies throughout the enterprise. This is one of those things that would fit for just about any COE. There's a lot of research out there about why they're important. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But a couple key phrases in here. One is that it should be a group of resources. I know that a lot of times when you start out, or if you're a smaller organization, you're a COE of one, and I get that. That's a lot of where people start. But the goal is to build that up over time. So you want to pull more and more people into that circle, even if it's not their job title, even if it's not something officially that they do. It's good to kind of try to build that, to make it a group of resources. And the other big piece that I think is important to remember is that it's not just deployment. A lot of COEs historically, and especially in the BI space, have focused on deployment. Like, if we get the software installed and we get the users trained, we can go like this, we're done. We've deployed, the COE has done its job. And we're really not looking at that model. We are interested in people who not only have these things deployed, but are using it and are gaining value out of that. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is really that second half, right? How are we going to get additional value out of what we've put together? All right, so that's the kind of official definition. So let's think about, why do we want to do a COE? If you're proposing this within your organization, this might be a question that you're going to get. Somebody will say, well, why do we need a COE? And there's a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of good research out there on COEs in general as a strategy to increase adoption and things like that. Gartner and other folks have done that. But specifically in a Tableau context, we might look and say, okay, well, what I'm trying to do is I want to institutionalize Tableau best practices in the organization, right? That's where I'm trying to get to. That's what I want to have happen. And if you know anything about how Tableau works, we always ask the question, why? Like if you say, well, I want this to be a line chart. Well, why do you want it to be a line chart? Right? And we go through that. So I would do the same thing here. And I'd say, well, why do you want to institutionalize Tableau best practices in the organization? Well, what I really want to do is I want to empower users. Right? I want to allow them to access analytical capabilities in my organization. That's what I'm really trying to do. Okay, that's good. Well, why do you want to do that? Well, if I do that, I'll allow users to create meaningful analytics, which is great. And so I'll go one more time and say, well, why do you want to do that? Well, I want to do that because I want to make better business decisions, right? I mean, Tableau is all about having people see and understand their data. We want to help people make better business decisions. At the end of the day, why do I want to do a COE? This is it. Now, there's a lot of other layers in the circle that are really important, and I need to not, kind of lose track of those. But what I'm really looking at is this is what I'm trying to get to, and sometimes it's important to kind of keep that marker out there in the distance and say, why am I doing this? Why am I going through this? What's the goal? This really is the goal at the very highest level. Okay, so I told you that I'm big on analogies. So I've already done one, the Netflix show, the 25 Minutes of Your Life You'll Never Get Back. There were a couple others that we've run through. We've talked about things like, what is running a COE like? And we've talked about this internally. Is it like herding cats? And it is, right? It's like you're trying to get all these people who have different agendas, and they're really busy trying to do things, and you're just like, can you go in this way? We're trying to do best practices here, people, right? And so you're doing all that. So herding cats is like a reasonable analogy. I've also heard customers describe it as spinning plates. I got to keep all the plates in the air at the same time. Wait, I've got a server issue over here, and I've got users can't get their licenses over here, and I've got all that stuff, and I'm trying to maintain that, trying to keep all that going at the same time. It's like preparing Thanksgiving dinner. I actually used this analogy a couple years ago, and in terms of, you don't realize how many things are going on at the same time until you actually are in charge of that, which thankfully I've never been. Well, there's a reason I've never been in charge of it. Because you have to kind of keep all these things and synchronized, and you can't have, well, the turkey will be ready at 2 and the stuffing will be ready at 3:30, right? I mean, it's all got to kind of fit together. There's a lot of coordination and project management that goes into it. And then we were joking, we're like, well, it's kind of like doing all at the same time, right? But I'm going to give one more, and this one is maybe a different analogy than what you've heard before, but I love it. And I'm going to say that running a COE is like the Modern Pentathlon. Now, I told you I love analogies. Rule number 1 of analogies is you make something understandable by relating it to something that people actually know. And if you're like me, you have no idea. When I started, I had no idea what the Modern Pentathlon was. So I have to give you a little bit of background. The Modern Pentathlon is a real event. It's in the Olympics, and it consists of 5 events, so as you would expect. But these are the 5 events, and this is why I love it so much as an analogy. The 5 events are fencing, pistol shooting, equestrian, running, and swimming. Wow, right? It's like, okay, yeah, that makes total sense. So thanks to Wikipedia, I got the background and the history on this. This was started like in 1904 or something like that. And the whole idea was they wanted to have the skills that a cavalry officer would have in war if he was ever captured behind enemy lines. So he would have to be able to defend himself by fencing and by shooting. He would have to be able to find a horse somewhere and ride it to safety. He would have to outrun his pursuers, and he might have to cross a river or a body of water to get there. So that's kind of how they came up with this crazy, originally it was like a military competition that they did, and somehow it got adopted by the Olympics. So the great thing about this, and the reason that it fits in so well with the COE, is because I love the fact that they have nothing to do with each other in most cases, right? Like, what about being a good runner helps you with your fencing, right? What about being good at pistol shooting helps you with your horse jumping? Nothing. It's not originally I thought, well, like a triathlon. Like if you can ride a bike 100 miles, you can probably run pretty far. There's some overlap there. But this is great because there's almost no overlap. And that's really what happens with a COE. We have these different skills, these different things that we need to master to really be good at it. And so I'm going to talk about what some of those skills are, what are the things that go in here, what are our events, and keep in mind that it doesn't always have to be one person that does all these, but these are the things that functionally a COE needs to focus on. All right, so the question is, how do you feel about being good at a very few, very different things? So here's our pentathlete. He's got his riding helmet on with his swim goggles. He's holding his shooting pistol in one hand, his saber in the other, and he's got his running shoes and his track jersey on. So clearly he's adopted to a number of different, I don't even know how you would train for this. Like, do you go to the pool? And I don't even know. But anyway, I love it because that's the real world, right? That's kind of what we live in. So what's our pentathlon, right? What are the events that we need from a COE? And I thankfully picked 5, or we have 5 of them. I mean, it actually fit very well into what the key skill sets and the key, let's call them events, are with the pentathlon. So I'm going to go through these in, not in any particular order, but these will be kind of the 5 events, and then we'll go into them in a little bit of detail. The first one is building data and governance structures. Okay, so we're going to talk about what does that mean? What does a structure look like? Who does it? How does it work? How should it work? What are the, we'll hit some of the best practices, things like that. We're going to talk about, of course, building useful analytics, right? That's a key capability, and usually when people think of the COE, that's the one they think of. Like maybe too exclusively, that we're going to help people build good dashboards, and that is really important. We need to help people build good dashboards, but that's just one of the 5 events. We want to enable people to be able to self-service. We want to have our organization, the people feel like they know what they need to do to get on Tableau, to build dashboards, to get value, to find data, all those kinds of things. This is one that I think is maybe not on every COE list you see, and that's change culture. But it's a real part of what successful organizations do in terms of their COE. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the cultural changes that need to happen. But for those people who are not maybe comfortable or haven't worked in that kind of sphere, you're not a culture change consultant, right? This is a little bit different maybe than what you're used to. And then finally, just the basic, building a stable infrastructure, right? We need to be able to have an infrastructure that supports us, make sure it works, it does all that. So these are our 5 events of our pentathlon. We're going to go through these in a little bit of detail. All right. Event number 1. Dun, dun, dun. Okay. Building a stable infrastructure should be kind of a given, right? We're like, well, once the server's installed, aren't I done? No. Or once the desktop's installed, isn't that all I need? No, there really is a lot to it. So we'll talk about a couple different elements of this. The first one is, yes, what you would think of, the actual server infrastructure. But that's more than just installed. Is it installed? Is it configured correctly? Do I have a high availability plan? Do I have an architecture setup that will support me? Do I know what I do in terms of downtime and things like that? Do I have server administrators who are trained? Do I have a backup and restore plan? All of those pieces that go into it are really part of what makes for a good, stable infrastructure. And I think some organizations, depending on how you brought Tableau into your organization, this may have been the primary thing you focused on, or it may have been an afterthought, right? And so you kind of need to look and say, okay, where are we with that? How well do we manage that? But more than just the initial configuration are some of the ongoing work, right? The system operations. How do we perform upgrades? When do we perform upgrades? Do we perform upgrades? Some of those kinds of issues. Dev, UAT, and prod environments. Do we have version control? Do we have sandboxes set up? Those kinds of things. Do we have a process for identifying long-running queries? Do I know when dashboard performance has gone poorly, even if I know nothing about what the dashboards are, just because I'm doing good system maintenance and system monitoring? It begins sort of with, if you think about it, if you're familiar with Tableau Server, it has some reports that show you how fast did the background processes update and some things like that. I mean, that's good. That's maintenance or 101, but it goes way beyond that into a much more sophisticated operational capabilities with automation and integrating into your core systems as well. You may have some other systems you need to integrate to. You may have Salesforce. You may have an authentication mechanism that you need to get integrated. So making sure that you have all of that taken care of as part of this will help you ensure that you're positioned for growth. The main thing with this is if this is immature, it will begin to become a real burden on the organization, right? You can get away with the basics of having it installed and configured for a while. But normally when you're looking at COE, you're saying, hey, we're trying to grow this and we're trying to kind of bring more people in and do all that. And at some point, if it's kind of like if you ignore it, it's like brushing your teeth, right? You'll get a cavity, right? It's actually going to cause problems. There's 2 tendencies that I see with this. One is that people who are in the COE who are maybe more business focused will say, oh, well, that's just IT. They handle all that for me. Right? I don't have to worry about that. That's why we have IT. They do the servers, they do the upgrades, all that. And I caution against that because they really need to be part of what is going on. They need to be part of the team, part of what your overall, because you're depending on them, right? And they can tell you things about the usage of the server that you probably never knew, just because they can identify what happened, they can look at the logs, all those kinds of things. The other thing I've seen is, on the other side, if IT is kind of the focus, is that they say that building a stable infrastructure is the COE. Like, well, I have a COE, I do all this stuff right. And that's obviously not what we want either. So I think you can make an error in both ways. This is one element. It's a really important element, but it's really just one element of what's going on. So that's our first event, building a stable infrastructure. Okay, our second event is building data and governance structures. So this involves a number of things. First of all, data source planning. Have I thought through what data sources I want to have available? Do I want live updates? Do I want extracts? How often will they be updated? How will they be updated? Do I have the right permissions? All those kinds of data governance issues. Do we have security set up correctly? All that planning that needs to happen. Oftentimes when you first start out, it's sort of a little bit of Wild West, which is fine, right? People are learning how to use Tableau, learning what data's out there. They're uploading dozens of spreadsheets, and but at some point we want to take control of this process and manage it. What are our security requirements? So what are our regulatory requirements? Do we have other security rules? Do we have role-level security that needs to be implemented? How do we want to implement that in a consistent way? How do we make sure that once I implement this particular implementation for one data source, that I can do something similar potentially for another data source? Content management processes. So these are things like, how do I get rid of old content, right? If everybody is allowed to upload stuff, which is great, but it hasn't been touched in a year or whatever you define, what is my process, my governance process for alerting the user, maybe moving it to an archive folder, maybe eventually deleting it, right? And at first it can be kind of manual, but at some point that's a process that good COEs automate. And they can tell you that, okay, we've got 63 pieces of content that are haven't been looked at in the last 180 days, and the ones that haven't been looked at in 250 days have all been moved off to a folder. They're due to be deleted in 10 more days or something like that. You send notifications out, all that whole process. As you get bigger, you can do less and less of that manually, and more of that has to be automated. So the other piece of content management processes is things like promoting content. So have I thought through my process for how content, let's say, goes from UAT to production, right? Is that a formal process? Is that something where I'm like, no, just change the name of it? I mean, there's some thoughts on. You can make that as formal as informal as you want, based on what the needs of your environment are. But you should think through that in terms of what the actual process is. Do you want to have reviewers, right? Do you actually want to have say, okay, before this can be moved to production, I have somebody who reviews it and actually does the promotion for me. Kind of a more formal, like dev to UAT to production kind of process. Depending on what the needs of your organization are, that process needs to be considered as well. And then finally, just the overall site project user organization. How am I going to use sites? How am I going to use sites? Am I going to use projects? How are my projects going to be named? How's my content going to be named? How are my users going to be added? How is my groups going to be set up? Who's going to maintain that? Am I going to use Active Directory? All of those kinds of decisions really go into building a good governance structure. And again, at first it's sometimes ad hoc, but over time we want to define those in more detail. So one of the common questions when we work with customers is we talk to them about the whole sandbox idea. Do you want to provide users with a sandbox, either their own or maybe their departments, where they can, without any rules, just sort of drop a lot of stuff in there? How wide do you want the sandbox to be? Do you want it to be open? Do you want it to be restricted to an area? Do you want it just to have personal sandboxes? What if they want to share things that are in the personal sandbox? How do we do all those things? So thinking through all those kind of governance decisions is one of those key things. And there's a ton of things out there on best practices on that, but a lot of it is understanding the needs of your organization and what you really need in terms of governance. I would say there's two common mistakes on these. One is I do see too much governance in some cases, right? I know we all think governance is a good thing, but governance is like mayonnaise. A little bit of it really helps, but a lot of it can be overwhelming. And you can actually ruin something by having, I've gone into customers and I was talking to them about, okay, have you thought through your governance? And they were like, yeah, we already have a model. And they showed me the model, and they said, okay, here it is. And it was a big, kind of a flow chart of different projects they were going to set up and sites and all that, and the permissions and structures with that. And it was like, tiny little font, filled the entire page, like a Visio with little boxes. I'm like, wow, that's a lot of governance. And they're like, oh no, this is just for one environment, right? And they had another one like that for UAT, and another one for that for prod, and stuff moving back and forth. I'm like, unless there's more to what your environment is than, from a security perspective than I'm understanding, that's just way, way overkill. I mean, you're going to run into usability issues for your users when they're like, so wait, I got to go through how many steps to move something to production, right? And it's like, that's not going to work. So too much governance is unfortunately a fact of life. In the data world, the biggest mistake I see is what I like to call the one data source to rule them all strategy, right? It's like, okay, I am in charge of creating data sources for my user. I will go in, I will get a fact table, I will join it to every table in the entire data warehouse, and I will publish it. Therefore, you now have access to all the data, go for it, right? And in one hand, you've done something good in the sense that you've made sure that they will have access to the data that they need. However, they will probably never find it, and they will probably never use the data source because it'll be so slow. And they're like, why are there 1,000 columns in this data source? Well, I didn't know what you wanted. So from a data source governance perspective, right? I like the idea of thinking about there's all the data is here. How do I cut it up this way? And also, how do I roll it up this way and publish those data sources? So that if somebody is just interested in inventory data, and they only need it for at the end of each day, they're not going to have to go down to the order level to get that information where they'd have to think about, okay, how do I aggregate this, and why is there 200 million rows in here, and all that. So we need to actually think about kind of that data strategy ahead of time to make sure that that fits with what our organization needs. It takes a little bit of planning, right? You really need to kind of understand the rules of what an organization is trying to do. The other thing I tell people with data is don't try to solve everything. Like I mentioned, since you don't have one data source to rule them all, don't feel like you have to solve every possible question people could have, with this data sources you're trying to build. It's okay to have a data source that 80% of the people will use, the 80-20 rule. Yes, there will be people who need ad hoc access to every field in the database. That's fine, but I'm not going to make everybody else use the data source that you need. I'm going to create stuff that's specifically for most needs in the organization. It's going to be quicker, it's going to be more efficient, it's going to be easier to maintain. Okay, so that's event number 2. We've only gotten through 2 of the 5 events. Uh-oh. No, we're good. We're in good shape. Okay, event 3. Building useful analytics. Again, this is what people usually think about when they think about a COE. So it's all the good stuff like the visual design. So are they using interactivity? Are they using drill down? Are they using basic design principles? People get intimidated because they think, oh, well, all my stuff has to be like iron viz quality. It's like, no, it just has to, sometimes all you need is a bar chart. That's cool, that's great, right? And sometimes visual best practices means turning a grid into a bar chart. That's it, right? Don't overthink it. It doesn't have to be, have graphical images and all that kind of stuff all the time. But knowing the principles of visual design is a key piece of knowledge for the COE, and a key thing that as a COE leaders, you want to make sure you're disseminating through the information, through the organization. So if you think about it right now, you have, there's classes on this. There's tons of resources on good visual design. Actually, there was a class on Monday that's actually a takeaway from the 2-day class on visual design. Lots of people have gone through it. It's very useful. It's very helpful whether using Tableau or anything else. It gives you an overview of how design is supposed to work. That knowledge is knowledge that needs to be moved throughout the organization. Designing useful analytics for performance. So it's one thing to have a great looking dashboard, but it's really important to have a great looking dashboard that responds. And if you kind of sort of break the rules on like, well, I have 78 sheets on this dashboard, right? It's like, well, okay, it looks cool, but it's loading 78 sheets every time you load the page. That's probably something we don't need to do. Or calculations that run this long because that could easily be done another way. All of those design principles that you don't necessarily see on the front end, but they affect the overall performance. A lot of what we do in Tableau Professional Services is performance tuning. And when we do performance tuning, there's only 3 things that it can be. Usually, it's either the hardware is just underpowered, which happens sometimes. It's the data sources are not configured correctly, or it's the visual design. They're blending things in weird ways and all that. So understanding the principles of performance and understanding how to use those is really important. And then finally is branding. So having some kind of organizational consistency is a great function that the COE can perform that people just sort of get. They're like, okay, yeah, if I'm in one department and I go to a different department, my dashboards, I mean, they might be different, but they shouldn't look completely different, right? They should have some consistency. So one thing a lot of COEs do is they'll build templates, or they'll build like best practices, style guides, consistency guides, things like that. We understand everybody's going to have different needs for a dashboard, but you can certainly say, look, when we do our filters, we always do them on the right-hand side, or whenever, we always put our logo down in the bottom right, or these are the color schemes that we use by default. Those kinds of things are easy to do and really help. The other way that helps you is you should be able to get to the point where when anybody in your organization wants to create a new visual, rather than going up into desktop and saying, okay, file, new, right? They should just say file, open one of the templates that you have out there on the server that maybe has a dummy data set. And now all of a sudden they've got the right layout, they've got the right formats, they've got the right text, fonts, all that stuff has been done for them. And what you'll see is that the overall quality of what people produces goes up significantly just by having that one little piece of information available to them. Okay, event 3, building useful analytics. All right, event 4, changing culture. I mentioned this is something that maybe people are not entirely used to. We like to really get people to focus on business questions. And so there's a technique that we use, which is all about getting customers or getting people to ask why somebody wants to do it a certain way. So if you're somebody that's used to kind of building a grid or whatever, it's like, well, why do you want that data? How are you going to use that? And that whole technique of kind of focusing on what the real business issues are helps you to open up other visual design methods that might be more effective for what you're trying to do. Agile analytics development. Rather than sort of saying, okay, we're going to create a spec and we're going to throw a spec over a wall and we're going to have some developers work on it and then we're going to send it back. We really want to get interactive. We want the users to be involved in the building. In some organizations, that means the business analysts are actually doing the building. In some cases, that just means they're working closely with somebody who's on the Tableau team. That depends on your particular organization. But the idea is, in any case, we want to do iterative things, right? We want to be working together and saying, okay, well, have you thought about it as a bar chart? Let's look at that. Have you thought about it as a design, it designed in this way? Or what about a heat map? How would that work for what you're trying to do? And getting that whole idea of working together and getting the right people in the room and actually building things interactively as opposed to handing over specs and that kind of stuff. That can often be, especially if you've got 20 years of classic BI experience behind you, that's a bit of a culture change. And so getting people to think about that and do that can be a little bit of a challenge. How do you build a data-driven organization? I mean, I know this sounds like a total big picture, like, don't we have management consultants to do that? But you're really trying to teach people that using data is, if it's part of their job, there's ways that they can do it to help them make better decisions. There's probably a ton of people who are using maybe Excel a little bit or whatever, and just don't know that there's better ways to get that data. There's better ways to become a data-driven organization. I think a lot of times at the executive level, they'll say, yes, we want to become a data-driven organization. That's really important to us. We want to have data as part of who we are. We want to train people in data. But sometimes that gets lost at the ground level. And a COE can be very instrumental in making that happen at the ground level. And then finally, just getting people to focus on visual analytics. So I really, the less Excel or reports in Tableau that look like Excel that we see, generally that's a sign that we're being effective. There are times when grids are important, but those times are probably an overall subset. So are people still going back to what they've always done, which is kind of getting, they're just using Tableau to get the same spreadsheet they've always gotten, and they want 42 tabs and different dimensions and all? Or are they really using it to do visual analytics to be able to drill down and get into things in more detail? How do I get people to do that? We'll have to show them, right? Going back to our first analogy about analytics, it's not enough to just say, here's your instructions, you should build visual analytics, here's the best practices. No, I have to show them how to do that. I have to understand their business problem. I have to get down there with them and say, okay, well, let's work on that together. Let's actually create something that might be a little bit different. Part of this is just understanding where my organization is today, right? Understanding where they are and what they've come from, what are they used to. Some people just jump on this right away, and they're like, oh, cool, yeah, I want to do it visually, that looks a lot better. Other folks are like, I'll take Excel out of my cold, dead hand. All right, Next, enabling self-service and onboarding. This is one where we want to really help people get started. So we want to understand what does it take for them to be kind of a self-starter in Tableau. So if you have somebody that's motivated, how do we make sure that they have everything they need to kind of get going? What's the training that we're providing, right? So what are the things, the actual, not just formal classroom, but what are the other resources that we have available either internally or externally to make sure that people get up to speed? What are the needs? What are the options within the organization? This is a big part of self-service, and it sometimes gets ignored. Am I providing easy-to-use data sources? I mentioned before, right, the one data source to rule them all. Honestly, if you want to kill user acceptance, just give them absolutely horrible data sources to work with, and I guarantee you they won't use Tableau for very long, right? So enabling them with good data. Now, sometimes they have their own data, and that's fine too, right? They've got all this stuff on their desk. But if they're using organizational data, this really needs to be taken care of if we want to have any long-term success with self-service. And then finally, just promoting everything through a community structure. So if we know that users are going to, they want to learn and they're going to start out, I'm a huge proponent of doing like little mini celebrations. So we've had customers where new people have come on and they've built like a really basic dashboard. It's like a bar chart and a grid below it. Right? It's no big deal, but it actually replaced what they were doing before. And they put it up on Tableau server, and we celebrate it, right? We work with the COE and we're like, look, they didn't have anything, right? And this is what they created. And hey, it got 75 hits in the last month, right? So people are looking at it. All those little things that happen throughout the organization that where you see those self-service, kind of little green shoots happening, you've just got to celebrate those, right? Have a community associated with it, helping to build up those motivated Tableau users who want to become champions in their in what they're actually doing. So making sure that all that is part of kind of your culture, the COE. We celebrate victories. We never look at somebody and say, well, that's not a very good visual. It's always positive. Like, okay, well, here's how it can be better, right? That's a big part of it. It's a little bit of just getting people confident with it. I've had lots of people who said, well, they'll come to the COE and say, will you build this dashboard for me? And what I always tell the COE is like, don't do it. What you should do is say, I'll tell you what, you build version 1, and then I'll come and sit with you and we'll work on it together, right? And what that does is it's completely diffusing of that fear of like, I don't know how to do this. Because you're saying, it doesn't have to be perfect. Nobody else is going to see it but you and I. But I just want you to take that first step to maybe install Tableau Desktop, to learn how to connect to data. And you'd be amazed how far they take step 1 once they do that. Because they're not afraid, right? They're not afraid somebody's going to say, well, that's a dumb dashboard. They know, and they know it's going to get better, and they know it gets published. So just making it easy for people to be successful. It's a big piece of it. All right, so those are our 5 events. One other principle here, having a balanced COE. So I've kind of put the circles sort of where they usually fall if you have sort of IT on this side and business on this side. This is, normally, obviously, IT handles the stable infrastructure and usually data governance, analytics somewhere in the middle, and then it kind of goes this way as you get more and more into the business. So that's usually how things fall. But those are the skills that each group is usually pretty good at, right? So I showed this slide to somebody, and I hope they were being smart, but they said, it looks like the business is trying to sink the ship and IT is trying to save them over on the other side. Like, that wasn't the intent of the visual, but all right. We'll let that one go. Okay, so let's talk about the importance of being well-rounded. So we've talked about the 5 events, right? These are the 5 things that we need to do well. And we don't have to be perfect at all of them. But let's look at, these are 2, oops. Okay, so this is the gold medalist in 2016 in the pentathlon. This is how many points he scored in each of the 5 events. Okay, so, I don't know, they were all pretty close, right? And so that's when he won the gold medal with this. So then what I tried to do is I said, okay, well, what if like Michael Phelps was in the modern pentathlon, right? Okay, so what would that look like? So I had to actually go in and research the scoring system for the modern pentathlon, actually go in and look at the, it's like, okay, how do we get points, right? And so I did that, and so he's in orange. So yeah, I think he's going to win the swimming by a long shot, right? He's going to beat everybody. And then I looked at the individual events. You can actually, if you miss like 3 jumps in equestrian, you actually get 0 points. So I'm like, there is no way a 6'7" guy is going to get a horse over a bar. He gets 0 points, no question. And then you get a few points just for like, being able to run, and if you can hit the target once, I figured he might do that. And fencing, even if you lose every match, which I figured that he would still get a few points. So that's my guess at how the world champion and Michael Phelps would line up. So this is a reminder that we need to work on all of our skills, right? We're going to be better at some than at others, but we want to make sure that we're looking at a balanced approach to this. We never want to let one event be something that prevents us from being successful. So it's great to be Michael Phelps. You'll win one event, but you won't win the gold medal. All right, quick transition. How do we make this happen? So this is all what we need to do, right? And now I'm going to give a little bit of just some background on kind of the specifics of some steps. I mentioned like a project plan. So this is kind of how we can actually implement it in our environment. All right, what are the key steps? This is like any project that you would see and implement. There's nothing earth-shattering about these 5 steps. First, we're going to do discovery. Then we're going to do a plan. Then we're going to present that plan. Then we're going to implement. And finally, we're going to refine. Okay, so this is, again, any plan that you put together would probably look something like this. It would have these 5 basic steps. But let's talk a little bit about what these look like specifically in the context of a COE. My intent for this part of the presentation is for you to be able to get some kind of more detail on like how would I actually do this in my organization, right? If I was actually, on Monday or whenever I recover, and I'm actually going to think about what I want to do, this is some of the things you might start planning out. These are some of the steps you would actually take. Okay, so what does the discover process look like? So the discover process is really, the key is understanding your gaps, your strengths, your weaknesses, right? So I want to know, if I was training for the Modern Pentathlon, the first thing I might do is go out to the shooting range, practice some fencing, do a little horse jumping, do some swimming, do some running, and kind of like look at my scores, right? And say, okay, how do I measure up? What I'm trying to understand is, where are the key gaps? How does that work in Tableau? Well, if I'm trying to understand where my infrastructure is, I'm probably going to go and look at my server and look at the logs and say, how is the performance of my dashboards, right? How much RAM and CPU am I using, for example? How much dead content do I have out there? Am I managing any of my content? I might look at the quality of the visual analytics that are out there today. Okay, are they up here? Are they down here? Are they, is there a wide disparity? What quality do I see? So I'm going to evaluate myself in each one of these events. I want to understand what's the prioritization of each one of these. So the point of discovery is not to criticize myself or, oh my gosh, I'm terrible at this. It's all about understanding what's the most important thing for me to work on, right? How am I doing in all 5 events? Where are my 5 bars? And then I can have a better idea of where I want to go next. So after I discover, I want to plan the work that needs to get done. So I'm going to look and say, I really need to work on my governance model. The lack of, the Wild West is killing us, or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe I put so much governance in, nobody is using it. Everybody's publishing everything to their own sandbox, and nothing is ever moving it to production because it's too hard. I need to understand what those are, and I need to plan those out. So this is, again, what is the most important thing that our COE needs to do? What do we need to do first? Where do we need to get those little victories? If it's training, that's something I probably want to get some lead time on, right? If I know that, gosh, my people just don't know visual analytics, they don't know how to build the right visuals, I want to create some either internal or external training. I probably can't get that scheduled next week, so that might have some lead time. So I need to start thinking about that one particularly early. And then the other thing I also encourage people to do when they're building a plan is to create like a mission statement. I think it really helps both the people who work in the COE and the people who are like out in the organization trying to go, well, what do you guys do, right? It's a really good way to summarize what your organization is focused on doing. And I've seen a lot of our customers that have COEs have done this, and they put it on their intranet site, and but it's good to keep in front of you. It really does help focus you on what you're trying to get done. And if you're building a plan, if you haven't already done this, it's a great time to spend a little time putting that together. Go in some of the previous TC decks and steal them from some of our customers. It's a great way to get them. change a few words. It's good. So then we're going to present this. So we want to be able to show what is it we're going to do. We want to make sure we understand why this is important. We're going to share our results. This is what we found. These are the kinds of things that were important to getting better. Here's where our shortfalls are. We want to get an interactive discussion going, right? We want our key stakeholders in here. We want IT in here. We want the business people in here. We want executive management in here. We want sponsors. We want Tableau champions. We want everybody discussing what we have found. And sometimes I know those meetings can be notoriously hard to schedule because just people are busy. But by doing that, we're actually going to get a real view of what people think of what we're presenting. And that's absolutely critical. We have to make sure people are on board with what we're planning. If we're saying we're going to do A, and then we're going to do B, and then we're going to do C, we want to make sure people are on board with that and that they believe in it. So all the key stakeholders need to be involved. I'm not sure how your executive management works or how they, how much involvement they want. Do they just want to know what you said, or do they want to be in the room? However that works in your organization, just make sure they know what your plan is and what you're planning to execute. Then you go into your implementation. So we're going to say, let's just say we do something kind of agile where we're creating sprints, right? So we're going to have like 3 weeks of work. We're going to prioritize the areas that we want. We're going to complete those prioritized tasks. And we're going to realize that not all areas will be in every sprint. I may spend 1 3-week period where all I'm going to focus on is culture change. All I'm going to focus on is fixing the server issues, right? Now that doesn't mean I'm going to ignore everything, but for that sprint, I'm going to have this, one of my 5 events is more important. Think about it, again, going back to our modern pentathlete, I bet you they probably go to the pool every week. I bet you they don't go horse riding every week, right? There's going to be certain weeks where they're focused on weight training or something else or fencing, and other weeks where they have to do other things. And that's going to be true as you build your implementation plan. You don't have to do it all at once. So here's some examples. I won't go through all of these. These are just kind of typical things that we see as people move from deployment through enablement through scale. So like a data and governance, right? So I might start out with creating the initial user groups. And then over time, I want my COE to graduate to having security processes, automatic functions to add users and groups. And then eventually, I want to have that fully automated so that whenever somebody joins the organization and I flag them as a Tableau user, all that security and stuff is completely seamless, right? It all happens without me having to get involved. Another one might be, our enabling self-service. So we're first, creating a foundation. And then we're going to enable users with the ability to use visuals. And finally, we're going to capture even the ROI associated with that. Our infrastructure moved from basic backup, restore, publishing. I'm doing the basics. Next thing you know, I'm doing proactive performance monitoring and content archival. So I know when visuals are running slow, even before the people who maybe created them do, because I'm monitoring all that. And finally, I've automated all that so that alerts are going out when things are out of sync, when things are not correct. So I can move, as my COE gets more and more mature, I can move further and further down this scale in every single area that I'm involved with. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just an example of some of the things. Finally, what I want to do is I want to refine this. So I want to measure each one of these areas, right? I want to the degree possible, I want to know if I'm being successful. It's easy in sports. I can, check how fast I got across the pool, right? I can do all that. It's a little bit more difficult in something like this, but I have the ability, I can use Tableau to report on all this. So here's some sample measures that you might want to think about. If I'm going to use, I want to measure my data and governance. How well have I done? These would be some typical metrics that I might use. What's the maturity of my publishing process? What's my percentage of dashboards coming from approved data sources? What I'm trying to get at is, are people still using Excel as random data sources where I have no control? Or are they starting to get into a mindset of, I'm going to use the published and approved data sources that are out there? It may start out at 2% when I begin, and over time, I want to move that percent higher and higher. That gets into all the one version of the truth, data-driven enterprise. All of those things will happen if I get better at that. If I'm building useful analytics, okay, well, how would I measure that? What percentage of my visuals are using templates or best practice, right? How many of my dashboards have been reworked to take advantage of visual best practices? Maybe, like if I'm starting today and I have 400 pieces of content out there, and I identify there's 100 of them that are really, need an overhaul. How many of those, have I overhauled? How many of those have been successfully rebranded or recreated? in my new environment. And if I just kind of did a quality assessment, what's the variability of the quality within my organization? What I always say is that like doing this won't necessarily raise the ceiling of your best users, but it'll raise the floor of your worst ones, right? It'll get the people who are struggling with visual analytics and best practices, hopefully, to move them up. That's really what what you're shooting for. So this is education, self-service onboarding, number of % of trained users. If you use LMS, which is a learning system, you can actually track that online. It's really cool. You can see which modules people have gone through, how many people have trained, what percentage of people are trained. All those are important things. The one metric I love to use for this is actually I don't know how you would measure it in your organization, but if you think about it this way, today, if somebody in your organization said, gosh, I've got a data problem I really need to solve, okay? And imagine that sometime from now, they have that problem solved using Tableau, okay? They've actually created a visual. How long would it take to go from that point to that point? Would it be 3 months, 6 weeks, 2 weeks? And then think about what are all the things that have to happen in between those two things. Well, first of all, they have to be aware that Tableau is an option in your organization. So there's an awareness task there. 2, they would have to know who to call or talk to or email to be able to get some help. They would have to be able to obtain a license. They would have to be able to get access to the data source. They would have to be able to know enough to be able to build something. And they would have to have some place potentially to publish it. So if I'm a COE, those are all things I want to make easier. And if I said, today that would take you 90 days realistically, well, how do I shrink that? Well, I shrink that by doing each one of those things better. And then it's going to make it so much easier for people to get on board quickly. And especially people who are really motivated. They're like, I really want to solve this problem. You're like, okay, it'll be 2 weeks, you get your license, and then the data sources will be available in the 3rd quarter. And it's like, it just takes all the air out of it, right? My infrastructure. So some of this is a little bit easier to measure, things like availability, uptime, timeliness of upgrades. That's a key one, right? It's not always necessary to upgrade the day after Tableau puts out a new version. I get that, right? You have things to do and all that. But if you're still on version 10.1, I mean, that might be a bit of an issue, right? That you're like, well, why are you still on version 10.1, right? Is it something associated with your infrastructure that's not really where you need it to be? Looking at things like response times, hits per day, user counts, all of that stuff is great because you can track it. There's numbers. You can go in there. There's already Tableau visuals. You can create more Tableau visuals. You can show your boss, here's what's going on with our environment. Here's how many users are logging in every day. Here's how many hits these new dashboards are getting. All that stuff is very, very trackable and is very, very important to kind of making sure to evaluating how we're doing. And then, of course, the hardest one to measure, but equally important, is probably culture change, right? How do you see that? Well, some things I look at is if I go into an organization and I see a lot of grids, that could be okay, but there's probably a reason that they're still using grids, and it's probably not for the best visual analytics reasons. What kind of participation do they get, either in internal user groups, external user groups? Are they active, using Tableau? Are there community support, that kind of stuff within the organization? So those are some just sample measures. Again, non-exhaustive list, but it's really important as you're stepping through your 5 steps to make sure that you've got a feedback loop on all this stuff. You got to know how you're doing if you want to be successful at it. So these are the typical attribute successes here. Okay, so this is Chloe Esposito of Australia. She has a gold medal in the women's modern pentathlon in Rio. She was not the best at any of the events. She was not, didn't come in first place in any of the events, but she did everything well enough to win the gold medal. Right? That's what it's about. And the last thing I want to leave you with is my buddy Bill Murray. This is having worked with a number of COEs and people in COEs, I understand that there is a part of this that is inherently frustrating. You're trying to move people in a direction organizationally, and it can be, there can be some tough times and all that. But feel confident that you are really moving the organization forward. You're doing the right things. It's just that not everybody is going to respond maybe in the time that you would expect them to and in the way that you would expect them to. I get people are busy and they have other priorities. But really, frustrations are kind of part of the journey. But feel confident that at least you're doing the right thing, right? If your business is saying we want to move forward, these are the things that really make it happen. I'll give a quick kind of personal anecdote on this. I was here, and I don't know if that person's in the room, but I was here a couple days ago, kind of walking the halls, and somebody came up to me and just said, hey, I remembered me from a session that I did about COEs a while ago, and he said, I just want to let you know, we started with 2 people, and we were just trying to figure out what a COE was. And he told me, he said, we've got 18 people now. We've built this out. We've got it spread throughout all the organizations. We've tried to do a lot of the things that you were talking about back then. And we've really seen a lot of uptake. And I was like, God, I got a little weepy almost, right? It was like, because it's very emotional. Like you're in a setting like this, and I know I'm just dumping information on you, right? It's just a ton of, it's like a waterfall, or fire hose, I should say, and I get that. But I want you to be confident that this stuff really does work. I've seen it work, and it really does help the organization move forward. The reason I love it is it's just you get to see some of these successes. In this room, I obviously won't get to see whatever you guys do, but when I work with clients, I actually get to see that. And so having that sense of confidence associated with what you do, makes all the difference in the world. So what I'm going to do is just to wrap up, go back, do your evaluation, do some measurements, find out how you're doing at all the events, plan out what you're going to do, and then go out there and implement it. So thank you. 2 things, surveys, and I've got a couple minutes. I'll stick around for questions, either group questions or you can come up to me afterwards. And please fill out your surveys. I really appreciate it. Thank you.